Back to the stage, Violeta Politoff from ANROWS. Thank you, Violeta, and thank you for your wonderful speech earlier. Please feel free to sit anywhere. Also, please welcome the Director of Practice Leadership at Our Watch, Cara Gleeson. Thank you very much, Cara. And our third panellist today is the Head of Education and Engagement at VEOHRC, Justine Vaisutis. Thank you so much. You all have a wealth of experience. This is going to be a very relaxed conversation actually for the next 40 minutes. So I'm going to go to the first question, and forgive me, I cannot see anything anymore. I'm going to throw the first question to you, Cara, because often when I give speeches about sexual harassment and indecent assault and violence against women, I talk about power imbalances, and this speaks to this very deeply. The gendered drivers of violence against women are binary and do not take into account gender diverse / LGBTQI+ / people of colour. How do we ensure an intersectional approach?
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a really exciting day that, I think there's probably been 4 years of work at Our Watch to get to this point, but decades and centuries of work in the Victorian community as well. Really, really great question. And since Change the Story, the National Framework to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children was released in 2015, there's been some really important work that is building on our understanding of this, including the Victorian government funded paper that was developed by Our Watch but with input by many others in understanding the experiences of family violence in the LGBTI community. Likewise, just last year, after a couple of years of national consultation and development, Our Watch, ANROWS and Vic Health released Changing the Picture, which is a resource that looks deeply into what is driving violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in particular. And there's also been great work of the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and Adele will speak more about this later in the next panel. But for some time they've been looking at the WEOHRC standards and the WEOHRC framework and working with Southern Cross Care, if I've got that right, and Mercy Health in understanding how that can be used in a context that has a very multicultural workplace and with different power dynamics within that. Lastly, the creators of WEOHRC, Joe and Mon and others in the room today, really wanted to look at this issue when they were developing the workplace equality and respect. So there's actually a practice guidance up on the website that's available, that's on taking an intersectional approach to preventing violence against women in the workplace. But it's an area that more work is being developed every day. And there is one particular project I just want to mention, Prevention and Action Across Our Communities, which is Victorian government funded as well, often leading the way, which is looking at the workforce capability, the understanding and the experiences of family violence prevention in the elder abuse sector, in the LGBTI community group and sector, and in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in Victoria as well.
Thank you for taking us through all that important work that's being done. That's something that I'm personally passionate about, because people in marginalised communities are less likely to come forward because of that greater power imbalance. So thank you. Justine, I'm going to throw this next question to you. How do we get our political leaders to be role models for this attitude change rather than just talk the talk? Their workplace devalues women.
Right, that's a small question.
Top question, most popular question.
Well, I think the response to that actually starts with all of us. So there's been quite a lot of talk today about the growing appetite from people to know what to do as an active bystander or an upstander or a friend or a colleague or a supporter. And a lot of the work that's happening across this space and a lot of the work that the Commission does, particularly a key project that's been funded again by the Victorian Government, by the Office for Women, has really focused on strategies for people to speak up when they see something inappropriate, and that is anything on the spectrum from gender inequality, whether it's structural or policy-based or attitudinal, to sexual harassment. So I think that the more all of us and our colleagues and our peers talk about this and call it out, the more action that we take with really proactive and effective strategies to intervene, and the more we agitate and put pressure on our politicians to do the same and to to walk the walk, not just to talk it, we will start to see real change. But I think, you know, this is a combination of leadership. So again, we've heard about the importance of leadership in a workplace to drive change. That it applies to the political spectrum as well, but it's a combination of grassroots activism and grassroots work and work from the ground up to push and change and challenge leadership attitudes and behaviour as well.
Thank you very much. And like you say, that bystander training is so important. I was really interested in one of the figures that you brought up earlier, Violeta, the 22%. There's a question here that relates to that. Is the decline in awareness of women being majority victims of DV-related violence related to the rise of men's rights groups?
PhD or two in there.
Sorry.
Well, I just have to say the NCAS can't tell us why. So the NCAS just cannot tell us why these things are changing necessarily. It's just telling us that they are. We have a lot of, we've done a bit of literature reviewing and have quite a list of possible reasons why, but we don't know precisely. One of the things listed in the list could be possibly that, but I think that there's lots of various reasons. I mean, the sense that gender equality has been achieved to some extent might be something that's driving this as well. That, you know, we believe in gender equality, and therefore there is gender equality on both sides, that kind of thing, which starts to kind of take that gendered analysis out of the problem of domestic violence. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't say definitively the reason.
Were you surprised by that 22% figure, though?
Yeah, it was very surprising. Very surprising. It was. I mean, basically that is probably, for me, one of the big standouts, because it's the only part of the survey that actually had a worsening of attitudes.
Exactly.
But when you look at the questions around gender equality and challenging saying that it isn't really a problem in Australia anymore, it does kind of make you wonder whether there's a relationship there around people kind of going, well, we've gotten there, and therefore why are we still talking about gender in this?
What we're speaking about here more broadly, of course, is the backlash, and I think everyone in this room would love more tools and ideas about how to handle these conversations while still keeping people engaged in the debate about gender equality. Cara, what advice do you have to give in the area of how to deal with backlash?
Not to refer people to the website, but on the website, the Workplace Equality and Respect website, there is a practice guidance on backlash. I think I also want to acknowledge Vic Health has done some really great work in this area. Their Encountering Resistance paper is really fantastic, because I think it's really important when people are questioning this work. You need to be able to understand, is they're questioning their process of understanding and engaging in it, or is it actually actively trying to antagonise your work and break down any gains that you're making? And if it's one, you need to pay some attention and engage, and if it's the other, you need to walk away, because you're just going to waste your time, I think. There will always probably be a 5% until we get to push up and move those sort of the middle bunch along. There will be a 5% that will be actively trying to, force us backwards, hence the Backlash name, and their main purpose is to waste our time and our energy and to defeat the momentum that is being gained across Australia.
And dealing with that 5% is a waste of our time and a further erosion of, it kind of contributes to the gender pay gap, the fact that we spend this unpaid time having to deal with trolls. Anyway, that's another conversation. Justine, here's a really good one for you. How do senior women in the workplace make complaints when encountering sexual discrimination or harassment, as likely doing so will jeopardise their careers?
That's a great question, and we get that question all the time. So the way we support anyone in the workplace, whether they're senior or not, is to make them aware of the multiple options and avenues for support. So, of course, a really well-structured and a progressive and a healthy, safe workplace will have an effective complaint system. We'll have applied all of the standards. They'll be familiar with this work. We know that those are few and far between, so internal complaints policies aren't necessarily effective, and by and large they're not victim-centric. They're not focused on the safety and the well-being of a victim, which is why we have this issue. So we always promote the other options available to individuals. So people can make an inquiry or a complaint, and they can do that anonymously to the Commission, the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, as well as the Australian Human Rights Commission. You know, Kate's work, that data is really important, and those stories are really important. They can contact other agencies that work in workplace health and safety. So they can contact WorkSafe, that operates under very different legislation and has different enforcement powers. So this is designed to make people aware that they have choices and options about how to manage their own complaint, and that they've got a right to complain. And they can seek other forms of support, so legal assistance or counselling, a whole structured framework of support that sits outside their workplace. And we know through our work that many people still don't know that that framework exists for them. So talking about this and raising awareness and educating people is really critical.
So true. The rest of these questions, anyone can jump in. How do you call out inequality? How men speak to you that make you feel less worthy, sometimes taking credit for your work, without being seen as just sensitive? All right, I'll jump in. Everyone took a step back right then.
Oh, look, I think it's really important for people to know that, you know, this is a journey, and we really hear, and today really reaffirms that people want to know what to do. So, you know, people acknowledge and they're aware that gender inequality is a problem, that sexual harassment is pervasive and it happens and it causes harm. And people want to do something, but they don't know what to do. So in part, this goes back to bystander or first responder action, and some of those strategies are just as effective for an individual who's directly experienced discrimination or sexual harassment. And that is to take a respectful and progressive approach. But we would also say to complement that and to combine it with the supports that are available to you. So, you know, push back against someone. If you don't feel safe doing that, talk to a colleague or a peer or a friend and explain what's happened and the impact on you. Access your internal structures, your internal complaints policies or processes. If they're not effective and you don't feel safe and you don't trust that the process will support you, access the external avenues available to you and the external supports available to you. You don't have to push back directly, and similarly a bystander doesn't have to intervene directly in order to show support. So there are, you know, really effective ways to support someone by taking them aside and saying, I saw that, it's not okay with me, I'm worried about you, are you okay? Here is some information, I will be a support person and I can walk through this with you. So there are ways, you know, to address this without being inflammatory, without being aggressive, without having to demonstrate the same behaviour.
The next question is about what happens before the workplace, because the questioner says, I think equality in the workplace starts at home. What can we do to help men take time out of paid work to manage the home, especially child rearing?
I can jump in. I think there's a bit of a chicken and an egg. What is the informal and the formal, and how do they all influence our norms and practices and structures that make our society? So I agree that gender inequality starts at the home, but it also starts at the workplace, and it's all a big soup, I guess, together. I think the way that we encourage men to take time out of leave is that we normalise it and we celebrate when it happens, and that does mean that we have to put men up on a pedestal when they take it, but we do need to normalise it and we need to put it up there. And I think Victorian Government's public service, their new I'm going to say the wrong thing, but the new rules around having both partners having access to parental leave is a really good starting point. When it's the standard, then we'll start to see a shift in people being penalised for taking time out of work and flexible work arrangements. That's going to take time, and it's probably going to mean that there is a delay, and there will still be a while when the people who are taking time out of work to do unpaid work or caring duties or to have flexible work arrangements will still probably have a bit of a negative influence on their career. And that's really, really unfortunate, but there will be workplaces that are leading in this way, and we need to celebrate that and show the business case behind it as well.
There's a good follow-up question to this, and I'm paraphrasing it, but how do we explain to people it's not just a nuisance or non-commitment to work to go part-time or take time out for caring leave? What are some comebacks if, say you're someone who's taken that time out and someone says that to you? What can you say to them?
I think it was really fascinating, the Welcome to Country, where Uncle Bill mentioned that around this country, before colonisation, that a typical working day was 5 to 6 hours, is that right? I think that we should be challenging the paradigm that what it is to be a professional person contributing to your society, and I think working a 40 or a 60-hour week is unrealistic if you want to have a life outside of that, and it's actually your life outside of your work that brings meaning to your work as well.
So sensible.
There is actually really good evidence to demonstrate that flexible workplaces, or workplaces that promote flexible working arrangements and encourage staff, and that's actively role modelled by leadership, that productivity increases, and that results in financial benefit. And again, the Office for Women funded a really good project to test this, and the findings were released just over a year ago. It was tested by a consulting firm, I believe it was Nous, in four workplaces, and across all of those workplaces there were financial gains and increased productivity, and those financial gains were in the millions in some workplaces. So I think it's around busting the myths that part-time work is somehow less of a commitment or somehow an impost on a workplace when the evidence shows otherwise.
Thank you. Are there plans for the NCAS surveys to be more localised? Would be really useful, this person writes, in our PVAW regional work. Would love your help.
So the NCAS, in order to try and drill down to a local level, the sample sizes become too small to be able to really make meaningful inferences from the data. So unfortunately, we can't go more local. We have state data in the reports, so there's some information about change over time for every state in the main report, although there's not great differences between states. And I think what the NCAS can provide is that in a lot of ways, those demographic differences really aren't the things that are predicting people's attitudes. So even though there's obviously people want that data, need that data, and they feel like that's how they're going to make the case that they need to make, in a lot of ways, the information provided in the NCAS is applicable across not just, across the country, essentially. So you can use it even though it's not necessarily for your specific area.
Excellent. There's a really tricky question now, and it's something I've been grappling with, so I can't wait to hear what you all have to say about this. How do we get more men to attend events like this? Anybody?
Well, again, I think the evidence that gender equality and effective strategies to prevent violence against women and everything that is in the spectrum in between is good for society as a whole. That includes men, and it includes, young boys and children. It's good for everybody. So we're fortunate enough to be in a position where that momentum is growing. but we have to maintain the momentum. We have to speak to that evidence, and we have to promote that evidence loudly and actively and relentlessly, because I think you will all agree that you are starting to see change, and we have male leaders in workplaces who are now championing this work, and that's a really positive mark of progress.
Can I jump in too?
Yeah.
I think we've seen a pretty steady incline and an increase on men being involved in this conversation and coming to events like this. I think we've also just seen a general broadening out of the people that are here, the industries, the age groups, the different locations that they represent, and their life experiences as well. But I think another thing to think about is to bring this work to the men. So working with male-dominated industries and sectors and working within there and bringing this work to life for their experiences as well.
A follow-up question here. Resistance to change often comes from those who believe that gains for women means less for me. How can we truly convince men it's not a zero-sum game?
Do you want to go?
Well, I think that there's definitely, so I've been working with a group of young people on the report for the youth report, and there's a lot of men, young men involved in that work, and they're really, really passionately working on this issue, and they talk a lot about how masculinity is damaging for men and women, and they use lots of examples of how that's the case, and I think sort of talking about that can be quite useful to sort of say, this is also something that will be helpful to everyone. Any other thoughts?
I think that's a really good point, Violeta, that this is also about addressing gender stereotypes that are harmful to men as well. In our work, particularly in the space of promoting awareness about rights and access to flexible working arrangements, we got a lot of feedback from men who felt that they didn't even know that they had a right to request a flexible working arrangement. That the law considers them a carer or a parent. They don't consider their gender first and foremost, and expressed a huge appetite to be able to access that right, and workplaces need to acknowledge that. And I caught up with a colleague of mine who works at a university a few months ago, and she had this great story about how in her work they had started running workshops for, specifically workshops for new male parents, so fathers of newborns, and this was part of gender equality work. And she said the workshops were profound because men came to them and realised that they worked in an office next to another male colleague who had had a baby recently, and neither of them even knew, because they didn't feel that they worked in an environment where they could talk about the stresses and the challenges and the pressures of being a new parent with their male colleagues, and they had worked next door to each other for years, so it's not like they didn't have a working relationship. So it just goes to show that those gender stereotypes, which inform a whole range of things like the backlash we've talked about, they're as harmful to men as they are to women. So addressing those is important.
And normalising it is
That's
so
right.
important.
Exactly.
And there was that research, the man box research, that also talked about that. Like, it showed that men who are very, very, very hypermasculine had a tendency to have other sort of issues with sort of depression, substance abuse, were more likely to than men who were further on the spectrum, less in the box than, yeah. So anyway, that kind of data is useful as well to show some of the impacts of that strict, rigid form of masculinity for men.
Toxic masculinity is bad for men as well as bad for everyone else. There's another question here. Great acknowledgement of the notion of cultural and linguistically diverse communities, but all the leaders in these works are the Anglo leaders. Is there any way to include more women from the called community?
That's a great question. I think Adele will be speaking to that later. But very happy to have a little go, but Adele will definitely talk more about some work being, again, funded by the Victorian Government out of the Multicultural and Social Cohesion Unit, the Stronger and Safer Communities project. So this is working with a number of community organisations with a focus on settlement and migrant services. The workforces have a broad representation of culturally and multicultural and migrant experiences, and obviously also servicing communities out. So the projects involved work facing the community and prevention activities, but also looking at workplace equality and respect internally. And I think it was some time ago I heard Adele talk about the work that Multicultural Centre Women's Health has done in Southern Cross care, and around how interesting the experiences of gender and migrant experiences are in the echelons of leadership within that organisation, and really sort of looking at how you can sort of unpack that and create pathways for migrant women to be progressing through this organisation that they may have worked in and for a number of years, but have not necessarily had the opportunities or the structures to be able to do that.
Thank you. The next question is, what do we do when we don't have leadership buy-in? That's a tricky one because, of course, the culture comes from the top.
I think you can do great work at times when you don't have leadership buy-in. Obviously, it is kind of like the golden sort of golden ticket that you want when you're doing organisational change work. But sometimes the way that you get leadership buy-in is through middle managers, or it's also through groundwork that's happening, sort of more grassroots activism as well. So there's several different entry points that you can come into organisational change work around gender equality, I think. Justine?
No, I agree. I think critical mass, is the way to address. That's a failure of leadership. I would consider that a failure of leadership, and critical mass is important. And the union movement is a really good example of that. And the union movement has done a great deal of work, particularly in the space of gender equality. And they are also looking at, addressing occupational violence, particularly towards women in workplaces, and that is around critical mass. So I know it can feel powerless, it can make an individual feel powerless when there's not strong leadership support, but again, this comes down to talking about these issues, at a grassroots level, and that's in the workplace and outside of the workplace. And that's not to say that you're all responsible for changing this, and it's an individual's job. But I think, the more we talk about it internally, and the more we encourage and influence that type of critical mass, the more we address failing leadership.
The next question is, what supports are in place to support women working on gender equality in industries that fund these roles as a checkbox rather than genuine investment?
Well,
it's a tough one.
Well, the critical mass here today is a good example of how to support individuals who feel that they're up against it, or that they've been appointed to do all of this work. I don't for a moment think that there's anyone in the room who knows that addressing these wicked issues, gender inequality and violence against women and everything between, it's a wicked issue, and it certainly can't be addressed by a single person. But that's why there are, I would encourage them to seek advice and support from the range of agencies and organisations that are doing really progressive work in this space, that have free resources, that are willing to have a conversation on the phone and provide support and effective strategies to people who feel like they're going it alone. And as has been mentioned here today, Victoria is a leader in this space. There are a wealth of organisations that support one another, that do really complementary work. We promote that work, we build on that knowledge and that evidence. So I would really encourage anyone in that position to access that and use it.
I could talk to you all day, but we are running out of time, so I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Violeta, what's the one message that you'd like everyone to walk away with here today?
It's difficult because mine was all about this survey, so obviously I kind of want you guys to remember the key findings from the survey. But I think probably in terms of trying to encourage people to take action in some way, and I think that it's amazing all of the things we've talked about today in terms of the different levels and the different entry points and all of those things. So there's not just one way of taking action, there's multiple, and that we can try and think creatively about what those entry points are, and that there's a lot of space to encourage others to do the same.
Cara?
Sorry, I might sneeze because I can just feel it coming on, so apologize if that happens. Look, I really think that Victoria is such an exciting place for this work taking place. The momentum and the people in the room today show that there is a groundswell. The attitudes that are actually progressing in the right way shows that there is that individual action and want for change. Through government leadership, I think in Victoria politically we're seeing incredible gains being made, and I think the Gender Equality Bill is going to set up a beautiful legislative framework and add to the other additional sort of frameworks that exist. So what I'd like you to take away is that middle part of this is organisational change, and the workplace equality and respect standards and the website are a starting point. They build on work that's already there, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to tell us how to do it better in the future. But it is a starting entry point if you and your workplace or your partner's workplace or your children's workplace is looking at what they can do structurally around preventing violence against women, jump onto the website.
I would really love everybody in the room to walk away and make a commitment to do one thing, and that can be any multitude of things. So it could be the next time I see something or hear something, I'm going to call it out, or I'm going to support the person who was on the receiving end of it. And that doesn't have to just be at work. It can be in your local sporting environment, you know, it can be in your personal life. It can be that, it can be, I think something happened at work today and I'm not sure about it, so I'm going to pick up the phone and arm myself with information. I'm going to find out if that was a breach of the law, if there's something I can do about it, how I can support myself or how I can support others. Or it can be jumping on a website, whether it's Our Watch or the Commission's website or WorkSafe's website or Vic Health's website. And I'm going to spend 30 minutes sometime this week to arm myself with education and increase my awareness of how to be an active player in addressing these issues.
Congratulations on all of your transformative work, and thank you so much for your wisdom this morning. Please thank our stellar panel. But wait, there's more. We have another panel in 5 minutes. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll see you all back here at 11:55 for our next panel.